And I was raped when I was 9 by a cousin. I became a sexually promiscuous teenager, did everything I could get away with, including faking a robbery at my house. I thought I was going to have a breakdown on television. And I said, you know, stop, we've got to stop rolling cameras. And they didn't.
Oprah Winfrey, the queen of talk shows, global icon, billionaire, and one of the most influential women and people on this earth. But how did a poor black girl from Kosciuszko, Mississippi rise to such prominence after being sexually abused by more than one person? From Mississippi to Nashville to Chicago, this is her story.
I came to live with my grandmother because I was a child born out of wedlock. And my mother moved to the north. She's a part of that great migration to the north in the late 50s. And I was left with my grandmother, like so many other black youngsters were. It actually probably saved my life. It is the reason why I am where I am today. Because my grandmother gave me the foundation for success that I was allowed to continue to build upon. My grandmother taught me to read. And that opened the door to all kinds of possibilities for me. And had I not been with my grandmother and been with my mother struggling in the north, you know, moving from apartment to apartment, I probably would not have had the foundation that I had.
And at a very young age, Oprah would build on that foundation, giving speeches at churches all over town, even though they were so poor that she wore potato sacks for a dress.
I was taught to read at an early age, and by the time I was 3, I was reciting speeches in the church, and they'd put me up on the program and they'd say, and little Mistress Winfrey will render a recitation. And I would do, Jesus rose on Easter Day, hallelujah, hallelujah, all the angels did proclaim. And all the sisters sitting in the front row would fan themselves and turn to my grandmother and say, Hadda May, this child is gifted. And I heard that enough that I started to believe it. Maybe I am. I didn't even know what gifted meant, but I just thought it meant I was special. And so anytime people came over, I'd recite Bible verses and poetry. By the time I was 7, I was doing Invictus by William Ernest Henley. Out of the night that covers me, black as a pit from pole to pole. And people would say, ooh, that child can speak. I used to collect money on the playground to take to church on Sundays from all the other kids. And at the time in schools, we had devotions. And I would sit and I would listen to everything the preacher said on Sunday and go back to school on Monday morning and beg Miss Duncan to please let me do the devotion, just sort of repeat the sermon. So in the 4th grade, I was called preacher. Kids used to poke fun of me all the time. It didn't bother me because I was so inspired at the time.
At the age of 6, Oprah's grandmother Hattie Mae would become very ill, which meant Oprah would now move to Milwaukee to live with a mother who worked as a maid and who was also a complete stranger to her. Oprah felt alone, and this experience was very traumatic for even the brightest child, especially when she was told on the very first night that she couldn't even sleep with her mother, who was boarding with a high yellow uppity black woman who didn't want a dark-skinned Oprah in the house, which left Oprah, who was sick, sleeping on the porch. But this would fail in comparison to the continuous sexual abuse that she will ultimately endure from the very people that should have protected her.
Well, I was living with my mother and living under circumstances that a lot of young children have to deal with today even. We weren't living in the projects, and if you'd asked me at the time if we were poor, I probably would have said no, because when you are living it and you don't know anything else, you think that's the way life is. And I was raped when I was 9 by a cousin, and never told anybody until I was in my late 20s. Not only was I raped by a cousin, I was raped by a cousin, and then later sexually molested by a friend of the family, and then by an uncle. It was just an ongoing, continuous thing, so much so that I started to think, you know, this is the way life is. And not until, I'd say, a year ago did I release the shame for myself, because I was in the middle of an interview with a woman named Trudy Chase, who has multiple personalities and was severely abused as a child. And I think it was on that day that I I mean, for the first time, I recognized that I was not to blame because I became a sexually promiscuous teenager, and as a result of that, got myself into a lot of trouble and believed that I was responsible for it. It wasn't until I was 36 years old, 36, that I connected the fact, oh, that's why I was that way. I always blamed myself. Even though intellectually I would say to other kids, I would speak to people and say, oh, the child is never to blame. You're never responsible for molestation in your life. I still believed I was responsible somehow, that I was a bad girl. And just released it in the middle. And so it happened on the air, as so many things happened for me, happened on the air in the middle of somebody else's experience. And so I thought I was going to have a breakdown on television. And I said, you know, stop, we've got to stop rolling cameras. And they didn't. Trudy Chase underwent years of therapy. And most of that therapy was videotaped because Trudy says that she wanted others to someday be able to understand that they are not alone in their abuse. And that is why we are doing this show. And so I sort of got myself through it, but it was really quite traumatic for me. Now, when I was living with my mother, I was very rebellious. I was, as I said, promiscuous and rebellious, and did everything I could get away with, including faking a robbery at my house to save my glasses and my dog one time. I remember, you know, stomping the glasses in the floor and putting myself in the hospital and acting out the whole scene. And I used to pull all kinds of pranks, ran away from home. I got to my father's house. I never told, and I used to lie to my mother all the time. I'd stay out, make up stories. I moved to my father's house. I never told another lie. Because I knew it wasn't going to be accepted. I knew okay, it stops right here.
Oprah did not receive much love or affection from her mother, and as a result, she would rebel and act out, even getting pregnant at age 14. But the baby would die prematurely, and Oprah was sent to live with her father in Nashville, who had his own barbershop and would provide Oprah with the direction that she needed.
I needed structure and attention. I require a lot of attention. Very strict father, but I mean, I love him for it today. I mean, at the time, I thought I couldn't imagine a human being being so strict. And what was he being so strict for? Yes, he was a big influence in my life, just very, not even as much strict as he was, had some concerns about me making the best of my life and would not accept anything less than what he felt was my best. I remember my father saying to me, you can't bring C's in this house because you're not a C student. If you were a C student, you could, because I'm not trying to make you do or be anything that you can't be. But you're not a C student, you're an A student. So that's what we expect in this house. And it was just so matter of fact. And I mean, I knew he was not faking it one bit. So I never even tried it. I never even tried to bring in a C because I realized it's just not acceptable.
Oprah's renewed commitment to her grades and overall excellence would lead to opportunities that most teenagers weren't afforded, including the opportunity to represent a radio station in a contest.
I got picked as 2 students in the state, and I think I was 16 years old at the time, for a White House Conference on Youth. I was being interviewed by a local radio station. A year later, I was 17 at this time, there was a contest being sponsored in town called the Misfire Prevention Contest. And the guy who'd interviewed me at the radio station, his name was John Heidelberg, remembered me. He said, what about that girl that was here last year? Yes. And so I was all of a sudden representing this radio station in the Misfire Prevention Contest. And I was the only Negro in a pageant of all red-haired girls. And it's the Misfire Prevention Contest. So the Lord knows I'm not gonna win. I won the contest. Well, what a shock Negro me. And that was the beginning of my broadcasting career, because when I went back to the radio station to pick up my Longines watch and my digital clock, they asked me would I like to hear my voice on tape. They said, would you like to hear your voice on tape? Just sort of as a little treat for me. Come here, let's listen to your voice. And I started to read. Now, I've been reading since I was 3. They couldn't believe how well I read, and I was hired there. So somebody said, sit down and read, and they said, come hear this girl read. And then someone else, and before I knew, there were 4 guys standing in the room listening to me read. And I was hired, 17 years old, in radio. At the time, I was still a senior, so I had to only work after school. So I'd finish, get there by 3:30, and I'd do on-the-air newscasts. Well, all my friends just hated me, because they're cutting grass. And my sophomore year in college, someone heard me on the radio and said, we heard you on the radio, would you be interested in working in television? And I turned them down 3 times. So I went and I interviewed for the job, and Chris Clark gave me the job. It was amazing.
Oprah, now a college student and also on TV, was beginning to find out that life isn't always easy when you're gifted and just want to fit in. She did not live the same life as her college friends.
I wanted to be accepted by them and could not be, because first of all, I didn't have the time. They wanted me to pledge, and I didn't have the time to pledge. I didn't have the time to be a part of all the other college activities or a part of that whole lifestyle. And it was very difficult for me socially. Really one of the worst times of my life, because I was trying to fit in school and be a part of that culture, but also trying to build a career.
While in the process of building her career, Oprah, who was a genuine soul, didn't quite understand the cold world of journalism and what it took to get the full story. But she was about to find out that in life, sometimes when one door closes, 3 more get blown open.
I only came to co-host a talk show because I had failed at news, and I was going to be fired. And the news director was paying me $22,000 a year. And so when I was called in and put on the edge of being fired and certainly demoted and knew that firing was only a couple weeks away, I was like devastated. I was 22 and embarrassed by the whole thing because I'd never failed before. My openness is the reason why I did not do so well as a news reporter, because I used to go on assignments and be so open that I would say to people at fires and they'd lost their children, that's okay, you don't have to talk to me. Well, then you go back to the newsroom and the news director, what do you mean they didn't have to talk to you? I say, but she just lost her child and, I just felt so bad. So I didn't do very well. I was absolutely too involved. I'd go to funerals of people and not go in. I wouldn't want to talk to them, disturb them. Cry on the air. It was that failure that led to the talk show, because they had no place else to put me. They put me on a talk show one morning. And I'm telling you, the hour I interviewed, my very first interview was the Carvel ice cream man and Benny from All My Children. Never forget it. And I came off the air thinking, this is what I should have been doing, because it was like breathing to me, like breathing. You just talk. Be yourself is really what I've learned to do.
In 1984, Oprah would move to Chicago to host the WLS-TV's local morning talk show. And in a matter of months, the show would go from last place in ratings to first place as the #1 watched talk show in Chicago, even outdoing the nationally syndicated Phil Donahue show. This was a big deal, as Phil Donahue, who was credited with introducing the audience format to shows, was considered the king. In 1986, the newly named Oprah Winfrey Show would be released to national syndication while becoming the highest rated talk show in history. But Oprah, who had now solidified herself as an actress, was just getting started, and she would acquire Harpo Studios, becoming only the 3rd woman in America at the time to own her own studio.
I ended up building my own studio because when I was shooting The Color Purple, I was not allowed the kind of freedom that was necessary to do that work. And what I really want to do is to create films for myself and other people that uplift, enlighten, encourage, and entertain people.
The Oprah Winfrey Show would reach more than 40 million viewers a week in the US while being licensed to 150 countries internationally. And Oprah Winfrey, the little girl who once wore potato sack dresses and slept on a porch, will become a global icon, as well as one of the most influential and wealthiest people in this world.
Well, what does this mean? It was so interesting. Like one day I was on the Forbes list, and somebody said, oh, I saw you on the Forbes list. And it was like, it just was another thing that had happened. It wasn't like, oh my God, I made the Forbes. And I think that the ability to The reason why people open up so much on my show is because I open up. They feel comfortable doing it, and they know that I am not going to ridicule them. I want everybody on the show, even if I disagree with you, to leave with a sense of dignity, to maintain their own dignity. I feel that my show is a ministry. We just don't take up a collection. And I feel that it is a teaching tool without preaching to people about it. I really do. That is my intent. That is my intent. All the mistakes I've made in my life, I've made because I was trying to please other people. Every one of them. There's not one that I've made because I did something because I really wanted to do this for myself. Every mistake I've ever made is because I went outside of myself to do something for somebody else that I should not have, to please them, just for the purpose of pleasing them. Not good. One of the most important lessons to learn is that we are all responsible for our lives, but nobody gets through this life alone. Everybody needs somebody to show them a way out or a way up. Everybody does. I think if you're on the road to success, is if you would do your job and not be paid for it. And I would do this job and take on a second job to make ends meet if nobody paid me, just for the opportunity to do it. That's how you know you're doing the right thing. And so my intention is always, regardless of what the show is, whether it's about sibling rivalry or wife battering or children of divorce, for people to see within each show that you are responsible for your life, that although there may be tragedy in your life, there's always a possibility to triumph. It doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, and that the ability to triumph begins with you. Always, always.